I am a licensed professional counselor, and I have been trained as a certified sex addiction therapist. I will talk about addictions in general, but I do come from kind of that training. I also have training in emotionally focused couples therapy, and I love attachment work. And when Rob originally introduced Prodependence, for me, it was joy because I grew up in a recovery family, and codependence was drilled into me, and understanding codependence. But as I became a therapist and started learning more, I realized there's pieces of that model that didn't fit with attachment and understanding attachment theory. And so, at least from my perspective, and when Rob introduced Prodependence, I was just really excited. So that's one reason I decided or wanted to join the group and share from a couple's attachment prodependence perspective. So I'm excited to do this. And so I don't know that there's anything else you maybe need to know about me. You certainly can ask that in the question and answer, and I'll go further. I love cycling. That's one of my favorite things. I've got a beautiful family and enjoy spending time with my family. But I love wearing socks. I don't wear a lot of shoes.
I was just about to ask if we can see whatever fancy socks you're wearing today.
You can. It's just hard to show you, but they're rocket socks. So I don't know if you can see it, but but yeah, I got my rocket socks on today.
Very nice. Very nice.
So what I wanted to jump in and start to talk a little bit about today is a concept in emotionally focused couples work where we talk about a pursuer and a withdrawer in a relationship. And a pursuer in a relationship is somebody, it's what it sounds like. It's somebody who is pursuing the other partner, saying, even though they may not be saying this with their words, what they're saying inside is, hey, I want to be closer to you. I want connection with you. And how it typically comes out is the pursuing partner is often saying things like, or feeling things like, I'm dying in here, or I feel shut out. My feelings don't matter. And they keep going to the other partner saying, like, sometimes it might sound like they're criticizing their partner. They might be telling their partner, you keep doing this wrong and you need to stop so that we can have connection. So you have the pursuing partner who is often what appears to be more aggressive, at least from an emotional standpoint. And the withdrawing partner is often the person who feels like they're never going to be enough, they're never going to measure up, and they are often pulling away because to them, they're trying to settle the emotions down. They're trying to calm the emotions of the other partner so that connection in their mind can finally occur. But when the withdrawer pulls away, it feels like abandonment to the pursuing partner. The withdrawer is feeling attacked and is feeling often rejected, or maybe even abused or criticized. So the withdrawer pulls away and the pursuer feels abandoned, and they typically pursue harder, pursue stronger, right? So we talk about it almost like this dance of one person's moving closer, the other person's moving away. And there's a couple of different ways that this can occur. Sometimes in a relationship, in a moment, you almost have two pursuers going after each other. And when we think about a couple fighting, that's probably the most common way that we think about it. They're going at each other, they're criticizing each other, or they're yelling or sharing deep emotions or whatever. And in the language of the couples work that I do, we call that find the bad guy. because it's like, oh, let's criticize each other. Let's point out to each other who's the bad guy. And once you realize you're the bad guy, we'll be okay. So then, so that would be two people pursuing. And generally that only lasts so long until somebody bugs out, right? They're like, I'm done. And so then they withdraw. The other type of a fight that couples get into would be, we call it the protest polka. It's actually Sue Johnson who talks about this in the way that I'm describing it. But basically you have the pursuer, and then and that's where the withdrawer is stepping out. This is the most common way that couples fight. One person is upset and if you will, attacking is what it feels like. The other person's withdrawing to keep the peace. And then you have a third style where it's very conflict avoidant, and neither person is really attacking. They're both withdrawing, and it may look very peaceful, but it's actually kind of scary, because in a relationship, we're just avoiding all conflict. And something that I like to share with my couples or individuals is that relationship bonding or healing actually occurs in the repair of conflict. So conflict has to occur in our lives, in all relationships, in one form or another. It doesn't need to end badly. In fact, if you think about like a baby crying, that baby is saying there's a problem, there's conflict here. And what creates attachment in a baby is that we show up for the baby when they're crying. Now, in a marital relationship or a partnership where we don't have a baby, a mother and a child, or a father and a child, we have two peers. We show up for each other. So there's that dance we're doing as we're trying to show up for each other. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how each of these partners tend to feel. And a lot of times we might criticize the withdrawing partner because it looks like they're abandoning the relationship, but the withdrawer is often trying to save the relationship by settling the conflict. So is this clicking so far, or am I a little too much?
You're doing good.
All right. So the withdrawer, as I said, often feels like they're being criticized. They're never going to get it right. They can never please the other partner. They feel like they're trying to fix it, and it doesn't work. They often give up or space out. They might dissociate, where the pursuing partner's like, "Are you even listening to me?" And so they're there, but they're not actively present, maybe, or even listening. They feel like it's best to avoid the fight. They often feel like they're failing. Sometimes they'll tell me, I feel paralyzed, I feel frozen, I don't know what to do, or they lose hope. So they feel like there's no point. Now, the withdrawer is often building up a wall and numbing out as a way of protecting and even preserving the relationship. And that's where if you imagine them building up a wall, the pursuing partner is, I'm dying in here, I feel shut out, which would be a normal response, right? Somebody else is building up a wall, I'm gonna feel shut out. But they also then feel like their feelings don't matter. They feel like, I hear phrases like, it's lonelier than living alone, I'm by myself, I'm dismissed, no matter how hard I try, I get no response. They often are upset with themselves because they yell. They do behaviors that to them like are out of character. The withdrawing partner will tell them, well, you're crazy. And in a sense, it feels crazy because no matter how much I yell and scream and fight, they keep pushing me out. They tell me I don't matter. They feel like they're just roommates. And so the pursuer is tearing down that wall violently sometimes to try and get the withdrawer close. And that's where I love, if we understand prodependence, we can have these unhealthy behaviors going on from the pursuer, from the withdrawer, and it's coming from a place and this intense desire to be close and to connect. It's not this sick or broken part of us, right? It's this part of us that longs to connect and longs to be close, but our behaviors can be unhealthy. So as I'm working with couples and individuals in trying to see that all of these behaviors are an unhealthy attempt to get close, it's not from this broken part of you. It's actually from this beautiful part of you that just wants to love, that just wants to be loved, that wants to be understood. So lots of times, I think if I remember back to the research, I think it was 75% of, so 75% in relationships. So I think this was a heterosexual relationship, if I remember right. 75%, the women are the pursuers. And so that would mean that 25% of the time men are the pursuers. So in a lot of relationships, you might see the woman being a pursuer. Now, I'm for one, I'm one of the 25% of men that pursue. I know that about myself, where I start to get anxious and I'm like, no, I need you. And I get upset. And so it's interesting because it can be different in every relationship, and I don't want to stereotype it for gender. But typically you're going to find, and if you think back to previous relationships you've had, you might have been a withdrawer and now you're a pursuer, because the dynamic of your current relationship is different than some of those old relationships. So we can kind of shift a little bit depending, but generally you've got that one's a pursuer, one's a withdrawer. So it's really important as we start to see each other that way and understand, hey, he's withdrawing or she's withdrawing because this is her way of preserving the relationship, or she's pursuing or attacking because she's fighting for me. Now, in the moment, that's really hard to come to grips with. But over time, as we do our own recovery work, we can start to settle in, or even after a fight, we get a breather and we start to go, okay, what's going on for her? What's going on for him? What's going on for my partner? So I thought today this would be a great thing for us to discuss. Any questions or whatever that might come up. So this is what I have as far as my teaching piece goes.
Cool. Thank you, Matt. Everybody, just want to remind everybody, the easiest way to ask questions is the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. You can also use the chat feature. It's not quite as anonymous. So this is for you. I can always ask questions, but you're here, ask us questions. And this is a chance to ask the expert, Matt. So the one thing I wanted to ask, Matt, is we kind of talked about this in terms of a romantic relationship, but it can be a parent-child relationship, employer-employee, friendships, anything, right?
Yeah, you have to realize that relationships, right? Anytime you have two individuals, you have a relationship happening, right? So I love that you recognize that this can occur anytime you have two individuals trying to connect. And so now the dynamic might be a little bit different if you have like an employee-employer, because of like there's a power dynamic there, right? Where that might be more of a mentor-mentee relationship, where so you might want to look, when we look at it, we might try and figure out, okay, is this a peer-to-peer relationship, or is this like a parent-child relationship, or a boss-employee? Because the dynamic is certainly going to shift. You may have a boss that's more of a withdrawer, that's more of a conflict avoidant type person, and the employee is a pursuer, right? And so that type of thing certainly can happen. And it just, when you see that withdrawal happen, or you see the pursuing happen, we have to look at it from an attachment or prodependence standpoint, which is they're trying to make connection even if it's not effective.
Okay.
Did
Yeah,
did I clarify that?
yeah, and the other thing I wanted to ask was, can the dynamic change between the two people? I mean, I have a cat, and sometimes I want her attention and she doesn't, and sometimes she wants my attention and I don't, and we flip flop. But do people do the same thing as my cat and I? She's on the desk.
Yeah, as your cat does. I don't know. I laugh because I was like, I don't know. I think all cats are withdrawers, right? Like,
she can be a pursuer.
No, that's fair. My cat can be a pursuer at times as well. No, I think the dynamic can change, and I don't want to peg somebody like, if you're a withdrawer, you're always a withdrawer, right? We're kind of looking for, in the dynamic of a relationship, like what is that overall theme as it occurs, especially when there's conflict, right? So yes, it can change, and I've seen it change pretty radically. If I've got a couple going through the recovery process and healing is being done, and let's say for instance the pursuer has more of an anxious attachment, and as they start to do some healing work around the anxious attachment part of them, then they start to become more secure, and they're not pursuing out of maybe fear of disconnection anymore. And it actually can provide some space for the withdrawer to almost push to a anxious attachment themselves. So then now they start to become more pursuant. And sometimes I've seen people go in an unhealthy way and go from an anxious attachment more to a dismissive attachment, where they're just like, I can't be bothered anymore. That's a little scary, but it certainly can happen. So on micro levels, I think I'm saying that right, you might see, and it may be the situation, right? Like in a romantic relationship, or in the relationship of your cat, right? Like your cat's like, hey, I'm going to pursue you because I'm suddenly having a need to be pet or scratched, right? You may have somebody in the relationship where maybe around sex, if in a romantic relationship, they're the pursuer when it comes to sex, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that overall they're a pursuing personality.
Can you talk a little bit about attachment styles and how that just some basic stuff, because you talked about anxious attachment and things like that.
For sure.
Maybe some of our listeners aren't quite as in tune.
Yeah. No, I realized when I threw that out there, I was like, I'm gonna probably have to dive into that, which is good. But so when you consider, so you look at it as like an x-axis and a y-axis, right? And the different parts of the axis, you essentially can break it up into 4 different attachment styles. And if you have somebody who is low anxiety, and the way that I'm going to kind of frame anxiety on this axis here is that somebody who's low anxiety is typically it's their fear of conflict, if that makes sense. So low anxiety is don't have a ton of anxiety going on, and then you have avoidance level, right? So somebody who has low anxiety and low avoidance tends to be somebody who's more secure. If you have somebody who has high anxiety and low avoidance, they tend to be an anxious attachment. Now, a secure person in a relationship is, I'm okay and others are okay. And if others aren't okay, I'm still okay. And if I'm not okay, others are okay. Like they're able to kind of flow. I don't have to be okay all the time, but I'm okay most of the time. Others don't have to be okay all the time, but they're okay most of the time. So it's kind of confusing if I don't maybe give you a chart, but hopefully this is making sense. When you get to the anxious side, an anxious attachment is somebody who doesn't feel secure within themselves, and they feel like in order to be secure, I need this other person to be secure with me. So an anxious attached person is often reaching to another person saying, I need you in order to feel okay inside of myself. And once you show me that you need me or that we're connected, then I can suddenly calm all my fear and anxiety. So I'm going to try and break this down as simple as possible. So then you get that lower quadrant where you have somebody who has high anxiety and high avoidance. And when you're in that quadrant, I'm not okay and others aren't okay, right? So they're in this weird space where like I'm not secure within myself and I'm not secure that others can make me secure. And I think if I remember right, it's like 6% of the population actually falls into that anxious avoidant. I think hopefully I said that right earlier. It's the anxious avoidant quadrant. And I think it's like 6%. And then you move over to the other side and you have where they have low anxiety, but high avoidance. And those are the people that are like, I'm okay and nobody else is okay. And in our society, those are the people who are almost like, I don't really need anybody else. In fact, I don't really want anybody else because people create problems. And sometimes when I have somebody who's struggling with addiction, they've almost developed this space where I have to learn to be okay on my own, and I have to realize that nobody else is okay. So I see a lot of dismissive attachment with people who struggle with addiction. But they can really be all over the board. It just depends. So these 4 different styles, there's really only one that we want to be working towards, and that's the secure attachment. I've learned to become okay with myself, and I've learned to be okay with others. And then you have some combination of the other ones, which creates that, difficult dynamic.
The dynamic. Okay, so we've got a question here. I was the codependent pursuer. We don't like the word codependent. You were the pursuer. Okay. But I am changing and healing myself. Your partner resists, says he stopped the infidelity. I'm assuming it's a he. But his narcissistic behavior is the same. So now you find that you're starting to withdraw and he doesn't care, and it causes more attachment trauma to you. How can we heal the wounds on a deeper level? A lot of question there.
No, that's a great question.
It's great, yeah.
So lots of times I hear people say I start to withdraw, and one of my questions here for you would be, are you withdrawing or are you starting to feel more secure, right? My guess is when you say you start to withdraw, maybe you're just pursuing less. And so the key in a situation like this is trying to figure out, because there's still some behavior that's unhealthy, how can I still reach for connection within the parameters that the safety has been built in so far, right? So it's tough because I almost need a specific example, but let's say the infidelity has stopped, and I'm not pursuing as anxiously as I used to maybe, but now I'm learning to pursue in other ways. I'm inviting connection in other ways. So how can I learn to be vulnerable in maybe in a way that allows vulnerability and allows for, I wanted to say him. Yeah, it says his narcissistic behavior. So I need to learn to be vulnerable, but that allows him to show up. So the risk there is you're opening yourself up to get hurt, but you can't heal unless you take that risk. So I will often say, you know, sometimes people are like, well, there's been safety created. Now I need to give full risk again. And I'm like, whoa, slow it down, right? You wouldn't hop onto a bus and sit down next to somebody and tell them your whole story. I mean, you might, but that may not be healthy. You might want to start with some basic chit chat and then, you know, build your conversation from there. So the same thing applies when trauma has happened. We don't want to jump in with full vulnerability. We want to give pieces of vulnerability and see how our partner responds. So I'm hoping that answers that question.
Yeah, I want to pop in a little bit. First of all, I just want to acknowledge that, stop it. Betrayal trauma is like one of the worst traumas that any person can experience. It's the person you love the most is stabbing you in the back. You know, the person you thought you could always trust did this to you. Oh my God, your whole world spins. So yeah, it's, you know, you're going to be raw from that. The other point I wanted to make was, you know, you did mention that you're changing and you're healing yourself. You know, you and your partner used to have a dance and you both knew all the steps.
Right.
You know, and you did it very well. Maybe you didn't enjoy it because you were screaming at each other the whole time, but you knew the dance. And if you're changing some of the steps in that dance, you know, you're going to step on each other's toes, and it's going to be a new friction that you have to, but as Matt said earlier, it's this friction and conflict that potentially helps us really, really grow an intimate connection.
When you go back to that concept of a dance, like, yeah, the dance was maybe really ugly, but you were learning to survive. Well, now you're learning this new dance. You got to step out onto that dance floor and say, okay, let's give this another shot. And so you learn to take it slow, and you learn to take that risk. Now, what that looks like for each person is going to be a little bit different depending on where the trauma affected them specifically.
Yeah. So, yeah, and if the person who asked that question wants to give some specifics, by all means do so. In the interim, we have another question here. What is a wise course of action when this communication dynamic begins and people get angry and reactive? Just the typical fair fighting rules. How can a couple push through and grow when emotions are high and on guard? Another great question.
Oh my goodness. And to be honest, I love it. This is probably one of the most difficult things for us to actually learn how to do. And so I'm going to talk about it, and it's going to sound so easy. And I'll explain some of it as I go, but this question honestly makes me giddy, because this is what I love to teach couples how to do. Because that next step, right? When somebody gets angry, when that dynamic starts to occur and conflict is present in a relationship, I teach, my clients know that I love the Kung Fu Panda movies. And so it may be kind of silly, but like, I think there is so much teaching in those, what I would say maybe silly kid movies. And I don't want to spoil anything for you, but in the second movie, he learns kind of how to not let other people's stuff hurt him, how to basically see it as danger. And so I call this emotional kung fu. And so when somebody starts to get angry, we have to almost pause, and we pause ourselves and not react. That is super hard to do, because they're likely they're angry and they're stepping on our toe. And so not responding with our counterattack becomes so difficult. But if I can pause in that moment and go, hang on, you're upset. I don't understand what's going on here. Can you help me understand what's happening? Because all I am seeing is that you're angry, And what I want to do is fight back, or what I want to do is run away. What I want to do is defend myself. So I slow the moment down and literally learn to just catch whatever it is they're throwing at me and hand it back.
Can you give an example?
Yes. So let's say somebody comes to you and they say, it's funny, my example, like, I don't see. I have an example, and then I realized it was one of my kids, and I haven't asked permission to use that one. So let me find one I can remember asking permission for. Okay, I'll give you an example. I had one time where I'm often late in my appointments, and it's because I have to explain myself, I guess, but it's because I'm late because I'm in the emotion with somebody, and I'm not like, okay, 3:00, we're done. See you later, right? So it takes me a second to wrap things up, and I tell everybody that works with me, like, hey, you're always going to get your time, but I'm often late. Well, I had a client come in one time and was really upset and said to me, you know what, I'm really mad at you. And I went, oh, what's going on? It's a lot easier, by the way, when it's like a client or it's a friend. When it's your spouse, this is hard to do. And they were like, well, I'm really mad at you. Well, you're rude. And I was like, oh, tell me more. Like, help me understand. Well, you're never on time. It's very disrespectful, right? Now, I could immediately in that moment go, are you kidding me? Do you realize? And I would never say this. It wouldn't be healthy. But if I were like, the person that just left here was suicidal, I was doing a safety plan and I was going through an assessment to make sure they don't kill themselves. Like, are you kidding me? Right? I have all the justification in the world in my own mind, whether it's right or not, as to why I was late. Does that make sense? So that would be a response where I'm not slowing down. I'm bringing my justification and I'm trying to change your mind. So in that moment, what I needed to do was go, okay, help me understand. And I said, tell me more about why me being late is so painful to you. And when I was able to create safety and show the client that I'm okay with you being mad at me, I more just want to understand what I brought up for you and how I can work with you on this. So I was able to then just go, okay, no, I get it. I don't blame you for being mad. I don't blame you for this feeling like disrespect. Tell me more about why that comes up for you in your life so that I can understand you better. Now, that's the moment of where I'm not continuing the cycle by getting defensive. I'm not continuing the cycle by getting like, here's my justification and you need to understand me. And as soon as I was able to de-escalate that, we were able to have a really good talk and a really good connection. And the truth is, I said, look, I get it. I don't blame you for being upset. And if that's going to be a no-go, I'm not even sure. You either have to schedule me the first session in the morning, right? Which I can't even promise that's always going to be perfect, right? Or find some other solution. Or you might need to find another therapist. That would make me sad. But I may not be able to show up for you on this particular issue. Sorry, was that an example that made more sense?
That's a great example. It's a great example for me because I'm a stickler on time, but I grew up with a mother and a sister who were not, and it was an issue in our home when I was a kid.
So you're like, I can totally relate to the time.
I'm your client. Yeah,
yeah.
So it looks like we've got a follow-up to the initial question here. So the initial question was about the woman is changing and healing herself. The partner is resistant.
So that was the first question. And then
the follow-up here, she says, I stopped chasing him 3 years ago. He contacted me after 11 months. So it looks like they got back together, and then he left again, and she let him go. He returned after 8 months again, then left again, gave him chance after chance, but he doesn't want to learn. So I'm fed up after 15 total years of this. But only the attachment trauma and anxiety want me to return to the relationship. So she's asking, how can I heal the wounds without him because he's not safe for me to be with right
Yeah, so this that's a tough situation because there becomes a point at which I think all of us have to assess and go, is this attachment going to happen? Right? And there's a couple of ways I've seen people do this and stay in a marriage where they basically are able to kind of grieve the loss of the attachment they want to have, and able to say, I'm going to accept that this is as much attachment as my partner can give. And so it doesn't have to end in divorce. It doesn't have to end in separation. But ultimately, you might have to accept that that's as much as he can give. But it sounds to me like, in the way that you've described this, is that you keep opening the door. You keep being vulnerable. And he keeps walking out on it. And as far as how you heal without him, that is going to take you maybe understanding what wounds are getting hit for you, what wounds you have had throughout your life, and working on that through maybe individual therapy, working on that. You can heal some of those attachments by having other healthy relationships that don't necessarily need to be romantic. I mean, I've seen people heal these wounds and never go back to a romantic relationship. But the way that you're describing it, you're fed up after 15 years. And so if I'm hearing you, he might be wanting to do it again, and you're just kind of deciding, I don't think he's safe. I mean, part of me says you may need to trust that instinct. He may not be safe, and you might need to move forward, working on your wounds and learning to have healthy attachments elsewhere. Like, that may not be the funnest answer or the most exciting answer for me to give, but I think there does need to be a place at which we say, I've given all I know how to give, and I'm not sure that me waiting is going to make a difference here.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, that's always a tough question to answer without, months of knowing each other, kind of a thing. But
I mean,
I was
like, one question as a therapist that I would ask is, I mean, you said here only the attachment trauma and anxiety wants me to return. And I would probably say then, focusing on that the anxiety, and what is it about the attachment trauma that is making you want to return? Because it sounds to me like if the anxiety is coming up, and maybe you're having, and I can only assume here based on the question, is that you're wanting to return maybe because you're not wanting to be alone. And a lot of times I think it's really healthy for a person to find that healing to where they're secure. Like, I don't think any of us enjoy being alone. I personally believe that, for whatever reason, we're hardwired for connection. And I could talk about some of the studies that have really been able to show that. And so it's not like you need to learn to be alone, but maybe learning to get secure and working through those wounds before you seek another relationship, maybe where you can get attachment that will be lasting. So
yeah, I agree with that totally. I'm the sex addict end of this equation. I'm a recovering sex addict, but I did not learn how to I did not get secure attachment as a child at all. And once I got into recovery, I realized that if I was going to stay sober long term, I was going to need to have some secure, healthy attachments in my life. I needed that support. It didn't have to necessarily be, a romantic attachment, but, I needed people. So I started kind of with people, a 12-step sponsor and a therapist. And, and then I started trying to have friends, and, then I got a pet, and, I just kind of ramped it up. I don't know why pet is ramped up over friends, but it is.
Yeah.
And, the next thing might be a romantic relationship if I ever feel secure enough to become vulnerable enough to have one. And by the way, I applaud your willingness to repeatedly be vulnerable. But it sounds like maybe you're done being vulnerable with that person. Maybe you need to find some safer people to be vulnerable with.
And to that, I think sometimes before we can actually grieve the death of a relationship, we actually have to, or the death of a particular attachment person in our lives, we have to give it enough chances that it's like, okay, the betrayal is strong enough now that I feel secure enough that I've given everything I know how to give, and I'm going to move on. But that's going to come from a place of like peace within us, not a place of like panic or fear, if that makes sense. So
yeah, it's like an addict having to surrender. When there's enough pain, we'll surrender. When the solution starts to look better than the disease, we'll move toward the solution. But until then, we'll stay in our disease. And I think relationships are kind of similar in that way.
Absolutely. And I loved how you talked about in your recovery that you recognize the need to get attachment elsewhere, even as much as you saying, friends and pets, and I'm not ready to step into a romantic relationship yet. When I am dealing with somebody who struggles with addiction, they have what I refer to as like a fractured attachment. Like, because they learn to attach to whatever their addiction was, they don't know how to fully attach to others. And so learning how to detach from their addiction and to attach to other human beings is a very difficult process. And one of the things I don't have any research behind this, but I've a number that I've come up with over working with clients for the years that I have is that I tell people you need to create a list of 18. And people are blown away, like 18 people, are you crazy? And I tell them, look, 9 of those 18 are people who know your whole story. You have full integrity with them. And I say this, by the way, for partners or people struggling with addiction, right? This goes for, in my opinion, every human being, no matter what's gone on in your life. And if you can start with one person, that's all you need. Start with one. And if that means you go to 12-step or you go to, it can be anything. You could go to bingo night, right? Like if you can find one person to connect with and begin your attachment journey and start adding more and more, the more attachments you create and the more attachments you learn to work through and nurture, the healthier you can have an attachment with a romantic partner. Too often, I think, unfortunately, we place all of our attachments onto our romantic partner, and that's a very unhealthy dynamic. I don't have a number for what, or even how to quantify what that breakdown would be, but I kind of look at it and go, like, I would be devastated if I lost my spouse. I mean, just devastated. But I have enough attachment around me that I know I'd be okay. Now, earlier in my life, my anxious attachment was so high, it was like, I can't survive without him. So what I think people need to learn to do is have enough attachment around them. And again, if I were to try and quantify it, which I think is impossible, it would be like 30% of your attachment, right? Again, I'm making this number up, is your romantic partner, and 70% of your attachment would be everybody else, right? So the major person in your life, and if you want to do, any other combination, right? You want the major focus of your attachment maybe would be into your romantic partner, but you have enough support around you that even if your romantic partner leaves you, you're not in a deficit. And I think that as you were talking about your recovery, for the person who was asking this question, I would highly encourage you. So much of your healing is probably going to come through you having that really strong base of attachment, and recognizing I would love to have attachment with my partner, even if he is coming in and out, until you feel comfortable and safe enough that you can move forward.
We've got another quick question for you about whether you do online counseling. But before you answer that, do you find that men are more guilty than women of having zero support other than their spouse? Especially because I see this all the time. Guys come into recovery, and I say, "Well, who do you hang out with?" "What do you mean?" "Well, who are your friends?" "I don't know. I wave to my neighbor." I mean, I'm like, that's not a friend.
No, yeah. Honestly, I love that you bring this up, because this is one of my favorite topics. I love working with men around, like, I refer to this as like a masculinity issue, right? Mm-hmm. Because I believe that what you're saying, what the observations you're making are totally true. And so a couple of resources real fast that I'll share. There's a podcast on NPR called The Hidden Brain. And there's an episode in there called The Lonely American Man. And it touches on this concept, and it has some really good, it talks about some studies that have been done, some really long longitudinal studies, I think I'm saying that right, that have been done for nearly 100 years, all about men and connection. And there was an article on Harper's Bazaar, and I'd have to pull it up, and it was called, I have it ready because I share it all the time, and it was called "Men Have No Friends and Women Bear the Burden." So that was the name of the article by Melanie Hamlet, and that was published back May 2nd, right? I believe that there really is a lot of awareness coming around this issue, and that is that men specifically, and there's lots of theories as to why, tend to have little to no support. And then when they get a girlfriend or a boyfriend, right, they put all of their need for connection on their romantic partner, and then it's not that they maybe even cognitively think this, consciously think this, but what ends up happening is my happiness is dependent on how much my partner can show up for me. And that's a terrible burden. Like, at first, it may feel really flattering. We may be like, "Oh my goodness, that feels fantastic," right? You need me, you want me. But it quickly escalates, or maybe slowly escalates, to being the impossible. There is no way one human being can meet all my needs. It is just not possible. I love massages, I'm not going to lie. And to be honest, my partner's hands get tired and not into it. So I actually have some really good buddies who I call up and I say, "Hey, I need a massage." And I have buddies that I specifically call just for safe touch. And to be honest, I love it because I can have conversation and I can get touch, and it feels fantastic. So anyway, I hope I didn't deviate way too much from what you were talking about.
No, that was perfect. We just had a chat feature question asking about those resources. The NPR podcast is called The Hidden Brain, and it's the specific episode is The Lonely American Man. And then the Harper's Bazaar article is Men Have No Friends and Women Pay the Price or Bear the Brunt or something.
Women Bear the Burden.
Bear the Burden. I'm going to look both of those up. I'm going to put them on the SRH site here, probably early next week, because I think those are really powerful resources.
And those are just, like, honestly, two quick ones that I tell people on a regular basis. There's really a lot of resources around this. And if you listen to the Hidden Brain podcast, I believe that it cites different studies and sources. And so there is a lot of work being done in this area. And it's one of my favorite things is to work with men who literally come in and basically tell me I'm terribly lonely. And so much of my work, even when I, like, let's say I have a man who's an addict that comes through my door, he's a little surprised that the very first thing I'm pushing him to do is to make friends. He's like, well, and sometimes I'm like, look, we can't worry about your acting out behavior unless it's dangerous, unless it's right. It obviously causes conflict in a romantic relationship or other relationships. But if I can get them into forming secure attachment bases, I know that the addiction is going to come down. The intensity of the addiction is going to come down. So one of the very first things I'm doing is pushing them to get connection. But truthfully, they're terrible at it. They don't even know how to be vulnerable. They're awful, right? Like they're basically telling me, I've never opened up, and you're asking me questions I didn't even know I had to answer, or that I could answer. And I have friends in my own life who aren't addicts who will tell me, you're my best friend. And there's times where I think, really? We only go to lunch once every couple months. I'm your best friend? How sad. And I love them, but it's just the sad state of how things seem to be.
And women are not without issues in this regard, I think, but I think men are just much worse at making friends.
Well, I think it's socially acceptable for women.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, women can go to lunch together and hang out and, have their Thursday lunch and, play bridge, or whatever it is, I'm talking about my mother here, obviously. I don't know anybody under the age of 80 who plays bridge, but my mother plays bridge like 6 times a week with her women friends.
Yes. Yeah, where's the bridge club, right?
Yeah, it's there's a great podcast about addiction, and it talks about, the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it's connection.
Absolutely.
When we're connected, we don't feel the need to engage in those behaviors. I want to get to the last question here before we run out of time, and this is directed specifically at you, and somebody put the Harper's Bazaar link in the chat feature. Thank you, which I'm going to open so I can save it for later. The question is, Matt, do you do any sort of online counseling?
So that's a great question. So the answer to that is yes. The only struggle that we run into is that there were some recent laws passed in the United States, in different states, where essentially somebody would need to, I'm in the state of Arizona, and in order to work with somebody online, they also have to reside in Arizona. And so I can't do, most of the time, if somebody calls me and they're out of state, like if they're out of country, I might be able to help. I'd need to look at that. But if they're out of the state, I mostly just try and find them somebody in the state that they reside to get them the care that they need, just because the ethics behind doing mental health services online with telemedicine and whatnot has just gotten a little bit, it's changed very recently.
It's murky at best.
Yes. And so some states are different, and so I'd have to hold a license in that state. And unfortunately, there's not like a national license to be able to cover every state.
Yeah, and I think that's probably going to change within the next 5 to 10 years, but it's not going to change tomorrow. No. So if you're in Arizona, by all means, call Matt. If you're not, email us via the website. Just use the contact us feature and say, I need somebody who can do this kind of work in my area. And we'll, Tammy or I, whoever gets the email, will do our very best to find you somebody who thinks like Matt does.
And if to be honest, people ask me, like, I like your approach, and I would really look for somebody who has an attachment-based perspective. Yes. Emotionally focused couples therapy, if they've been trained in EFT, can be a good way to try and find somebody who is my style. But it doesn't. I mean, it's not exclusive to that. There's lots of attachment-based therapists who see things the way I do, and so I'll take that as a compliment, by the way. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, anybody who's trained in EFT or and uses the word prodependence on their website is probably going to be really, really focused more on attachment than anything else, and understanding.
Prodependence on their websites. I mean, there's probably plenty of therapists who haven't maybe even discovered prodependence yet, and so you can't. But if they have prodependence on there, for sure it's a safe bet.
Yeah, they've at least read the book and they're in contact with Dr. Rob, and yeah. So this was for our very first webinar with Matt. This was amazing. Thank you, Matt. Thank you everybody for joining us. Matt is every other week, every second and fourth week of the month, and Kim Buck is going to be every first and third week of the month at the same time and using the same link.
So either way, you're going to get somebody awesome.
Yes, Kim is amazing. If you haven't seen Kim, she's completely awesome.
She's fantastic.
So thank you everybody for attending, and Matt, I'll see you in 2 weeks, and everybody else,
see you guys then.
Hopefully in 2 weeks.
Bye.